So I went online and I did some searching and some looking, and we're trying to find materials. The next incarnation of this class, I'm going to drop the PMBOK and probably try to push back towards the traditional textbook. So I have found some sources, and so there's a lot of videos on communication. And excuse my speech because I did get out of the dentist and I'm now chewing on my own tongue repeatedly. But there is a link down there, and you can certainly click on it, and that's an online slideshow. And so I borrowed this one. It's got a lot of really good information that pertains specifically to where we're headed in terms of communications for project management. And so some of this will be a review from your Business 201. You guys all have hopefully taken Biz 201. So we're starting to pull as you get closer and closer to graduation, starting to pull all of these pieces back together. And so I threw it up already. So really, communications is one of the central things that you're going to do as a project manager. So the reality is you're spending most of your time. So yes, I'm trying to get things done, but you're doing it through communication. So project managers, that's what you do nearly all of the time, is you are communicating. You're communicating with stakeholders, with people involved on the project, people that report to you. You're working on that idea of communications nearly all of the time. And so we want to make sure we have a really good grasp of that idea of what communications are. And there's some terms that you've seen. And so we know who the sender and the receiver, and those are pretty easy. That medium, the same as we use in like our network class, that medium is how are we sending the message. And that message changes based on how we send that message. Things have different weights. So if you actually get a letter from somebody you really admire in the mail, that's different than if you get a little tweet shout out, right? It seems to have a different level of importance to you. Well, the same way in here, when we're talking about projects, what that message is and how it's delivered is often distorted, or it has noise, something that interferes with it, because there's other things going on. And one of the biggest problems now is really the idea that we have too much communication. How do we pare it down so we deliver the right amount of information to the proper person? So, kinds of communications. And so, again, this is a rehash. We have formal versus informal. So, formal being those things going out generally in a written format. We have verbal versus nonverbal. Or you may think of written versus oral, or that idea of vertical. In other words, it goes up and down that chain of command versus horizontal. So those across your peers are at the same level of authority. And so we generally look at some of these as being kind of written in stone, that some of these are going to be a formal written document, some kind of communication. So things like that, the request for proposals, the project charter, the communications plan. So those documents that carry a lot of weight, that risk management plan, for example, tends to be a formal written document. Those carry a little more weight. Informal written, we tend to consider email. Now, I will say that there is some shift in this, because now a lot of companies are trying to go paperless, and we see this trend. And so now they are putting electronic documents equivalent to written, formal, paper-printed documents. And so you may see that shift, and that will change over your lifetime. You also have a difference between different types of verbal. So a formal verbal, so somebody getting up and speaking in front of a class, this is a formal verbal communication. But if we're just having a conversation, that is that informal. So formal verbal things like speeches and different announcements tend to be pre-written, so there is a copy of them. Informal conversation, there's less record of. And the problem comes about when you use something like a informal conversation, you make an agreement, things don't go right, and that documentation is not there for that conversation. And so it's something that's kind of an interesting way we have to deal with this. So, couple of other things. One of the biggest issues we have on these virtual teams is that idea of nonverbal communications. The reality is, depending on which study you've seen and who is looking at it and what kinds of things we're looking at, most of your actual content is delivered in a nonverbal function. So things like your facial expression, your body language, gestures, and all those different kinds of things mean more to most people than the actual words that they're speaking. And so, even on this, I'm recording this lecture for those people not in the physical class, but they don't get those kinds of things. They don't get when I do an eye roll because Justin's doing somersaults again or something. You knew you were going to get called out today for something. But so it's that idea that we don't get that. And so one way we do that now is we try to add video. Maybe we do our communications. So instead of just a dry conference call, we actually do a video link. But it's still not quite as good as being there in person. So a couple of ways you can also work with this is make sure that you're looking for active listening. So in other words, you're giving feedback, so that shows that you're listening, you're interpreting that message, and you're getting the correct message. So you can ask those questions. If you're in a team and nobody is saying anything to you, that's a little frightening. You may assume that they got all the information, but if they don't ask questions, how do you know that that really happens? And so I torture you guys a lot of times in here because I utilize you to get questions, and I will use that. So here's a couple of things in here you may want to look and make sure you can identify them. So what would be this? A project manager writes a requirement specification. This is an example of, so it says writes a specific specification. That's going to be a formal, written kind of communication. So an email, though, automatically we should know email is what? Informal. Now again, some companies are making it more of an official line of communication. So here at Peru, do we send you a bill in the mail for your college tuition anymore? How do you get that information? MyPSC or email. They have transitioned to saying that electronic communication is actually a preferred method. But sometimes there are things that mean a little different. So most of you in here are traditional age college students. None of you, as far as I know, have been on academic probation or gotten the "you're naughty" letter from the college, right? So if we send it as an email and it just goes to your email and says, hey, you're on probation, that doesn't really mean a lot to some students. However, when we used to send an actual physical letter to your parents, did that have a different import to some people? Yeah. So now the reality is with FERPA and other things it's a little harder to do, but that letter coming in had more weight to it. And so we have to be aware of that. Now, as you guys have went through life, you've depended on electronic communications, and so you may think that they're equal in weight. So we have a couple of things we need to deal with. So not only do we need to know that we have to create a communications plan, we have to manage it and monitor it. So in other words, managing, we're executing that plan that we've created, but we also need to make sure we're monitoring and controlling what's going on in those communications channels. And we can often get sabotaged by that idea that we have too much communication, and that's that idea of monitoring and controlling. So one of the things we like to do is set out very quickly and say, what do we need for information? How often are we going to send communication? So some stakeholders would like it if every morning at 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you send them an update. Are you going to have time to do that? Probably not. You also have to think about how I'm going to send these things. So maybe there's a weekly conference call or Skype-in session. Maybe we send out a weekly email. What's going to be included? Who is going to get this information? And so we really want to set out ahead of time, set those expectations down, and that becomes part of our plan. Our communications plan then is specified. And so if a stakeholder is complaining or you have an issue, you can say, this is our plan. Unless something changes, we're going to stick to once a week. We don't have time to do the project and send you out emails every day. So this is that idea of what kind of things go in. So everything from that project charter, the plan for the project, the documents, maybe we have specifications, all of those things go in. And then again, we're going to use a lot of the same things, our techniques, that expert knowledge that we have, our expert judgment. So different types of communications models. And some projects lend themselves to creating an online portal, for example, like a desktop that people can log in and see every day the progress. And you guys have seen examples of that, but not in a website probably. But how many of you have seen charitable contributions going up, and especially around Christmas time? And they'll put things like a thermostat up, and it'll gradually go up as people contribute money. That kind of idea, but now we're doing it on our project level. So these are all and part of the things that we're going to create inside of that communications plan. So what we have to deal with is math again. And the more people we have in our communications group, the more channels or the more things we have to do. So there is a formula for this. So if I have 4 people, and I go and I look at my formula, and it's not horribly complicated, n times n minus 1 divided by 2. That's how many communications pathways or channels we are creating with those people. So it doesn't look bad when we have 4 people, but look, by the time we get to 6 people, now we have 15 different models of how everybody can communicate. If we get more people in there, look how convoluted the channels get. And that's how some of these projects, and you've seen it around campus. If something happens on campus, you hear about it through all these informal channels, through people, long before we see anything from the administration saying this is our formal process about it. And so think about your own life and those small groups you're in. How do we manage all those communications channels? Do we assign them equal weight? Certainly not. So what we need to do is come up with that plan, and we're going to use some form of technology. Whether that technology is standing in front of you and it's just my voice and a microphone in a large group, or you're sending out electronic documents, or we're using Slack, or we're using some other tools, we need to deal with that. So a couple of things alter how we can do this. If what I'm doing is communicating with people through a weekly newsletter, and I have an urgent need to pass along information, that may not work. So I may need alternative methods to send out information in a case of an urgent issue. So if you had to wait for the Auburn paper to come out to find out that we had an active shooter on campus, that's not very effective. And I know that's a very dramatic way to think about it, but we look at different levels of technology. That printed newspaper isn't going to be very effective in that case. How do we respond on this campus in terms of communications if we had an issue like that? How do you guys get notified? Text messages to your phones, right? So that comes immediately to you. But that message is going to get diluted. If every time something happened on campus, so all of a sudden it became, hey, the sky is blue today, and you started getting text messages about that, that's going to lower the value of that message. Does that make sense? So ease of use is important. We want to make sure everybody on our team can use this technology. If we rolled out a project in this group, and all of a sudden we rolled out telephones on the desktops that had big old rotary dials, you guys would be lost. Because I don't think anybody in here, with the exception of Dolores, has probably ever dialed a rotary phone. You have, actually? Wow. Your great-grandma, aha. But what we're looking at is making sure people can use those things. If my team is primarily on PCs and suddenly we start rolling out tools that are only on a Mac, are we going to have people that are going to be lost and unable to use that technology? And I use that as an example because on my desktop, I'm forcing myself to try to reacquaint myself with the Mac operating system. And right now, those of you that have Macs, I have words for all of you because everything seems backwards and different. But if you have to go from a Mac to a PC, you probably have the same issue. And one of the issues we have is that confidentiality of our material. We now have the ability to blow out information so quickly, and once I send out an email, does that email stop at my recipient or does it tend to get forwarded? So I have to think about how I can limit sometimes information. And not necessarily that I wish you guys were all going to be working for the CIA, but even in a college setting, there are things that can be very sensitive if they come out earlier or at a different time or to certain groups. So we need to be careful about how we distribute that information. There are times it's better to go ahead and call that meeting and have a conference call or something versus sending out to an email that can be distributed then company-wide, for example. If you're on a team that your task is to prepare this company for acquisition by another firm, that is probably something that's going to be very sensitive and doesn't need to necessarily be sent to the entire world. So, the model, and you guys all did this in 201, you have this model where you have to take whatever you want to say or whatever you want to communicate, that idea, that thought, that process, whatever it is, that you have to translate it to a language that everybody can understand. So that is that idea of encoding. Your message has to be encoded. So it then gets sent out through some kind of a medium, and then the people that are receiving this message have to somehow take that message and or decode it and form something useful out of it. And at any step in there, this can get horribly distorted. We've all done this before. We thought we meant to say something in an email and we said something else, haven't we? Or you've sent it to the wrong person. You've used the wrong medium. So maybe putting your significant other out on Facebook when you have an issue is not the greatest method for communications, right? So you may have picked a medium that isn't appropriate. And quite frankly, do you get that same emotional impact if we're looking at something like a relationship by sending it via text as what you do in an in-person phone call or an in-person call or, sending face-to-face? No. And so we need to make sure we are picking the appropriate mediums, that our message is clear and understandable. Sometimes we even go to the impact of we will let people read it ahead of time. So we may have a select target group that we look at, and they can make sure that we are interpreting that in the correct one. So we also look at push versus pull. So push means I am pushing out a message to you. Pulling, so things like portals where we set up stuff where you can go at your leisure and you can get the information, we call a pull. So if I push information to you, I am forcing it out to you. If you pull it, that means you are going out and sourcing that information. So that is something you may see in a document to say, we are primarily going to be a pull organization for stakeholders. And that means that the stakeholders, we're going to have a portal, they're going to have a username and a password, and they are going to go out and get that. So this plan that you're going to create, and it's not really a bad idea, is that idea of communications. And you're going to communicate the communications plan. Isn't that a little weird? But the biggest one is what time, how often, what types of communications to those stakeholders. Remember, we're already spending 80-90% of our time communicating. How am I going to minimize the impact of communicating to those stakeholders? Do they need information? Yes. But I need to create a plan for that. So what the frequency is. Maybe on an even bigger project, I have somebody who is assigned as a communications director or a communications czar or whatever term we have in our corporation. And they're going to be responsible for communicating those on a continual basis. So every week they create a newsletter. We see it here. Do you guys get the email blast every Friday about what's happening on our campus? I don't know if you guys get that on your email. I know as faculty and staff we do. And they send out an email with a little newsletter that says these are all these kinds of things that are happening. So we've assigned a person to send that out on a regular schedule. And it shows up on Fridays at 1 o'clock or whatever it is. Our plan also is going to include then those methods and those technologies. What are we going to do? Are we going to use formal paper emails or memos? Or are emails going to be an official method of communication? Do we issue press releases? And some projects you may put press releases out. You may want to get the newspapers and other things involved in it. So maybe we have text messages. Maybe we have other models. So we want to list out as much as we can. So some of the other things you may need in this communications plan. And again, we're talking general project management from anywhere from construction to projects on campus to software. This can vary a lot. So one of the things that's very handy is the idea of something like a glossary. So we're all using common terms and we're all using the same terms for the same item. So think about if you're out there with a crew and you're going to dig a hole in the ground. Half your crew calls them shovels and half of them calls a hole digging thingy. It's going to get awkward very quickly. And we also, we a lot of times have that. So that glossary, we a lot of times use flow charts. So how does the information flow? Along with those flow charts, one of the things we often have is a chart of everybody involved in that project. That hierarchy of who's involved. Because a lot of times that gives us a method of how that information is going to flow. So those flow charts, that idea of information flows, are very important. And part of it, and none of you are ever going to be this way, but if you get bypassed sometimes in a chain of communications, you get your feelings hurt. And none of you are ever going to get your feelings hurt, and you wouldn't take it out on a project, but the reality is it happens. So these kinds of things, this drawing it out, detailing out the events, really help to do that. So we may have constraints. We may have constraints based on either company, organizational rules. We may have constraints placed by legal restraints. So if I am a firm working on a project for financial information, I may not be able to send out certain information about that would be considered insider trading. If I am talking about something like at the nuclear plant or somewhere that's considered classified, if I'm at Offutt Air Force Base, that methods and those means may be restricted. So there are a lot of different pieces we need to make sure if they are an issue. If I am working for a governmental organization, in a lot of cases they have some requirements that may be legislative in nature that says we have to do this or we don't have to do this. So in Nebraska, for example, any governmental organization that puts out a request for a proposal or signs a contract, that is public information. You can actually go in, there's a website for the state of Nebraska, and every contract that is signed on this campus you can see. If you are curious about how much they are paying the contract to have pop machines on campus, that's public and transparent. If you want to see how much they're paying for Microsoft for software, public and transparent. If you're curious how much a speaker is on our campus, those contracts again are all out there. So that's different than a private corporation. If I'm a private corporation and I bring in a speaker, I may be in my budget, maybe the only one affected and nobody else even realizes what's happening with that. So those kinds of constraints are different depending on where you're at. So this communications plan generally has guidelines. You may have email templates. So if you're going to use email as your primary communications method, you may have email templates. It may also spell out, we're going to use email through a certain server. You're not using your private email address. And that all of those emails are archived at the end of the project. So in case there's ever an issue, we can actually go backwards in time and look at those emails and decipher them. So this plan has a lot of details in it. So here's an example of some piece of it. So these are some different types of communications that this particular author found. And some of these are really nice. So a team briefing. So that may be on, when we say a restricted intranet that's only available to those members of the team, that it appears at 9 o'clock every day, and who gets it. So this is a great idea to put this together, something even as simple as this. So top 5 current risks come out on the email and the intranet, come out weekly, and all internal stakeholders. A budget and schedule comes out to the sponsor and senior management. Not everybody in the project needs every detail of the budget, so we can tailor that communications to only those people that need it, because we really want to avoid the idea of information overload. So, as we go through, we may find that our communications process isn't working as well as we intended. We created a document that said this is how we're going to do it initially. Are we allowed to change that process? As we monitor and we observe what's going on, we can create changes as needed if we need to. So we want to create that balance of enough information but not too much information. And so when you guys write reports and different things, in a lot of classes, you may have to write a 5-page report. And the first page is that executive summary, or you may call it an abstract. When those reports and things in a company get moved up, you need to think about who is going to read that. So the executive or that sponsor may be sponsoring 12 different projects. Doesn't have time to read the entire report, but he probably does have time to read that executive summary. The auditor for the project, though, they probably need the details. So we think about who is getting this material and how they're getting it, and we're trying to minimize information in some cases. So it's different than it was 25 years ago, even on a project. 25 years ago, it was hard to get enough information. Today, we're overwhelmed with projects and overwhelmed with the idea of information. And so we now have to think about how do we try to restrict or slice down that information. So, again, that idea of communications channels, I am pretty sure that through the process of randomization, you will have a question about communications channels on your quiz. There are several questions about it. I think there are like 73 questions in the pool. You get 20 of them, but there's 5 or 6 different channel questions in there. So my guess is you're going to need them and need to know this formula. Now, can you look it up? Yes. So if I say there's 12 people in a project, how many communications channels are there? Well, that would be 12 times 12 minus 1, or 12 times 11 divided by 2. I can't do that math in my head. Some of you might be able to, but that's the power of the world around us. We have those calculators. The bigger the group, the more communications channels. Those aren't necessarily, that means they're all going to be able to send emails to each other. It's the different ways that they can communicate, and we can see a message. So some things that we wanted to be aware of. So sometimes we lose messages. Sometimes we lose messages to people. And it may be because we're trying to give out a speech in a busy factory with a lot of noise. People can't hear, doesn't come out very well. If I am giving a speech and I have just been accused of sexual harassment, is that going to taint the message that I deliver? Yeah. So think about, right now, Urban Myers is a football coach. Is his message as a coach tainted because of knowledge he had of one of his coaches domestically having domestic violence issues with his wife? I think so. I think we see that. And so that sender, their reputation, that sender status, right now we are undergoing a process where our chancellor, Stan Carpenter, is retiring. We know that. So is his message then to the legislatures and other people diminished because they know he's going to retire? Yeah, I would say so. We also sometimes have to worry about language, and sometimes we say the wrong things in terms of that. Sometimes people even have prejudged or predetermined outputs. And so we have to see if we can sway them or change their minds. And so there's a lot of issues, and in terms of how projects are going to go, that people get them already in their head. They think, I am going to be the leader of this project. Maybe they're not, but they've already got that mindset, and so it can change how we're going to do it. So these are just a portion, just a tiny little bit of things that can go wrong. But you want to look at any kind of message and look at those kinds of things. Why are you doing that? So if I think about a couple of these, a contract, is that going to be an email? Is it going to be informal? Or would that be a formal written communication? Yeah, a contract would be a formal written. So, what about that? A stakeholder with high interest, but he really doesn't have any power, or she. Do they need to be informed of every piece of daily information on a project? Are we going to go out of our way to make special communications channels for a stakeholder in that case? No. So we do need to be aware of who it's going to and their power. Now, sometimes their power can shift in the middle of a project. And so sometimes we need to deal with that. So yes, we need to inform them, but we don't necessarily need to give them additional information. So that communications plan we created was said where you're going to get a weekly newsletter. That's sufficient. We don't necessarily need to bend over backwards. But communications is what you're going to do primarily as a project manager. You're going to spend more time on the phone than anything else. You're going to be working around that idea of how do I send enough communications. So there is a little quiz and some other questions in there. So I encourage you to download, look at that. Read the PMBOK guide on communications. Take a look at that content that's in there. Your project that you have an assignment for, when is it due this week? Tuesday. So that gives you all weekend to work on that. I've actually had a couple of people have already turned it in. Now you just went, overachievers. No. So some people may not have the weekend available, and so that's why I thought we'd try to switch it up and see. Because I know some people, if you work on the weekends or you have a busy, active schedule, the weekends are sometimes hard to do things. So take a look at that. Communications are really a prime subject. If you can communicate well, written and in oral communications, that is a great advantage. We push you guys to do a lot of presentations. And the reality is, that ability to speak in front of people, is it uncomfortable sometimes? Yeah, it is. There are times, even in here, I'm afraid to speak to you guys. I come in here, well, you're intimidating, Justin. No. There are times when we get into groups, it is hard to speak to people. And so planning out your communications, making sure you have the right facts, is really critical. But it's critical not only for project management, not only for this class, where I had thought about making you do an oral presentation on camera, and I didn't do it, so don't give me that look. But it really is critical. And those students who are able to master that seem to be able to go very far. If you're unable to speak in public, it really is a little bit of a detriment. So that is what we have on communications now. Remember, there is a discussion board due. Most of you have already posted. Make sure you put in your responses to that discussion board. I should have over the next day. I've pulled them all out to start grading them, and it's been just kind of a crazy week. I have had more phone calls from weird, odd individuals, including I've now gotten to speak with the State Patrol, police departments, and the fire investigators with the state. So, for a peripheral issue. So at some point I'll be able to share that with you, what all's going on there. But it's kind of interesting. I'm getting called in for a little bit of consulting, which is interesting. So not so interesting when they're ringing your phone at 4:30 in the morning. But all right. Any questions? Comments? Requests? Do we need to think about communications channels? That formula really is kind of interesting. And I would encourage you to think about it. When you get in a small group of people, notice how you start communicating in different and odd ways, and things get spun around very oddly. And there's some party games where you try to pass a message from one end of a group to another end of the group of people, and it seems to work very, very badly.